To a point that you made before, Celeste, and speaking of anti-capitalism, I will say I'm like proudly, I've oftentimes feel the mainstream of knowledge in this city is, especially that's in academic institutions, oftentimes misses most of what's incredible about this city. So I wanted to use that as an opportunity to use some of Celeste's images that she's been creating since the pandemic and the protests to facilitate the next leg of the conversation, and actually maybe get a little bit away from the campus and the academic campus to point how spectacular and rich, and not even just in like it manifests in many different ways, like how sophisticated some of the practices that exist out in our community are. And if you're only looking on campus, you're going to miss them. So these are some of the, Celeste, you just want to tell us quickly some of these images that you've created. Let's start with the Iota Mutual ones.
Yeah, well, I saw my community standing and rising, and I'm, this whole new era of, coronavirus living and, being isolated from each other, and then seeing these incredible photos of our community standing and rising and risking their lives to support our community. I I couldn't help but be moved to draw it, to just, to just reflect on it with some pen and ink. And these were very intuitive drawings. There's, I just sort of let the pen and the paper, so I know it sounds so cheesy, but, just sort of like, do its thing, because this was also my time to like really just sort of heal those little, things that were missing in my life, like community engagement and being around people I love. And so these are just my reflections on paper of, you know, of what's happening now. And so I go back to the point that we we know history is going to repeat itself because it's already happening. So we need to take this time to document what is actually happening. And a lot of the indigenous roots of Latin America, we were bookmakers. We created libraries. We wrote books. We built our history and we showed it in book format. And those books were burned. Those books were destroyed. And so if we're not careful, this can happen again. We already know it's going to happen again. And so as an artist, that's my job, to document what's actually happening in our community. And that's really what I was doing with these images.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Just beautiful.
Right. I was wondering, for all of the panelists, if you could sort of respond, well, not only to Celeste, but the intersections between identity and community and activism. So as we think beyond the university, beyond sort of these moments, into the importance of who you are to the work you do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, for me, it's like a parallel existence of them being individual, but them being like integrated, right? So there's the Tammy who is Tammy. There's the Tammy who is the South Sider of Milwaukee of the U.S., who's Puerto Rican, who has a Mexican family. There is the community that is the Milwaukeean, right? Born and raised here, family in Puerto Rico. And because of that, there's no ignoring social injustice that directly impacts me, right? So there are the pieces that are Tammy, there are the pieces of the Tammy that belongs to community and family, and then there are the pieces of Tammy that, because she's a woman, deals with machismo or sexism, because she's a Latina with racism, because she lives in the inner city with elitism, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a parallel process of like being mindful of those things individually, but understanding that they're all interrelated. You can't separate them.
Yeah, I'll jump in there also, thinking about, because the question was, who we are in relationship to the work that we do. And I mean, I feel like, at least for me, you cannot divorce the two from each other, right? The work that we do is also about who we are, right? And that in order to do work that orients itself around social justice along any axes, right, or even its many intersections, right, is also to do self-transformative work along the way, right? Because we don't get, right, it's the I and the we, right, is a collective, right? And it's always a reciprocal relationship, a dialogical one. And so you can't get the transformative work of the collective without the transformative work of the self in the process of that collective, right? And so, at least for me, right, if I speak from my personal experience, right, I'm a diasporic subject through and through, right? I left Puerto Rico when I was 15 years old with very little notice, landed in the continental United States. Without an idea of where I was going, and then starting a life, a very shifted life that has brought me to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, right? And so those types of experiences, right, are the types of things those are the lenses through which I come to the communities that I move through. And I think this is true for all of us, right? Who we are along the way is part of the work, right? So I think it's absolutely intertwined.
Celeste, did you have any thoughts?
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
It's okay. How do you see the intersection of who you are and the work you do? Either, sort of within the community, and you've kind of talked about it a little bit before, but I was wondering if you had any final thoughts.
Yeah, I think for that, for the most part, I was sort of lost when I was a youth, just like, who am I? I have white blood, I have European blood, I have indigenous blood, I have Mexican blood. I was just sort of like trying to find myself in a lot of ways. And so I had the privilege of traveling and living in Mexico and finding, the truth that I was seeking, and, finding the elders that I needed to start guiding me in a different path to knowing who I really am, and being okay with all three sides of those also. And then being in Milwaukee and sort of like, there's no escaping who we are, and I'm not going to deny one of my ancestors. One of my grandmothers isn't more important than the other grandmother. And so finding elders now, and the abuelas who are now helping me find, my ceremonial path of learning the traditions of my indigenous roots. All of that is a privilege, and I had to find it, and it took me years to find it. And so a lot of my art today is a reflection on all of that. And, it's like everyone has said before, there's no escaping any of those intersections. It's what makes us who we are, and it's my responsibility to be a part of that, and to show that you can be all of it too. I was always never like Latina enough or white enough. And so that's okay. That's my story. And we all have our stories.
I'm going to jump in with a question that we didn't send in preparation. But
Did we send anything in preparation though?
Oh yeah, yes. Other people did. Yeah, we just want to call people on the phone and have them show up. This moment is so amazing and profound and challenging and scary and all of that. I really want to hear your thoughts on the moment. What's exciting about the moment? What's reflected in Latinx communities in the moment? What's scary and or challenging about the moment? We haven't asked this directly, but I feel like we really should. Tell us about what is going on in this moment in whatever ways you would like to share.
And just to guide us into that, I just want to share the last few images from Celeste that have been created in this moment. So it kind of goes from pandemic to protest. So we have a few images to be part of that conversation.
Well, I guess for me, I don't want to go back to what was normal, you know, like there's no going back right now. And to me, that's my biggest fear, is that we're going to lose all of this energy somewhere just because of whatever, you know, life just keeps going. But I don't know how we go back, and I hope we don't go back. And I just, you know, like we need to keep going. I support the protests. I support these conversations, and you know, like we need to keep this momentum going. And I know it's exhausting, but that's when community comes in and supports us. We support community, you know, like we have to be there for each other. Right now, like I feel like we've all sort of been preparing for it if we've been activists for a while. And so I just think we need to keep that going, whatever that looks like.
Others?
Yeah. So I think what's really distinct about this moment, at least from what I'm seeing, is the COVID framework, right? Or backdrop, if you will, right? And there's a way in which the pandemic then seems to be at the backdrop of what's going on in ways that are terrifying, right? I mean, if we really think about what's going on, we're talking about a global pandemic that we haven't had a good intervention on, right? As the world around us is trying to continue to shift in particular directions, right? And yet, right, our cases continue to go up, right? We're looking at Milwaukee. The Latinx community is seeing spikes that are very, very concentrated in particular area codes in the south of the city, right? 53215 and 53204. In ways that really eerily reminiscent, when you look at the map, look like the north side did right around the beginning of March, right? And so if we're honest to what's actually happening here, right, is that we have a global pandemic on our hands that is linked to the continuous death of color that we have seen historically in the United States, right? These things are not unrelated. And so it's I think it's a unique moment, but it's filled with a lot of possibility for action. I mean, I think that's what we're seeing. But it's also a moment from which I don't think we're ever going to be able to kind of a shift or a return to some semblance of what the world was like before is out of question at this point, seeing as how the pandemic has entirely rearranged our economic structures, our social structures, right? And so it also becomes a moment for action, right? A moment to be able to intervene on things in ways that we may not have felt like we had the space to do so. And at least that's what it feels like to me. And yet at the same time, it's a very scary one, because we're not just dealing now with the branch of, say, the military police state. Now we're also dealing with a global pandemic in the backdrop of that, right? That we really can't lose sight of.
Yeah. Well, for me, on a spiritual level first, right, is no sin is dealt with till it's brought to light. And I think that what we're seeing in our nation is an uncovering of sin, or an exposing of evil, an exposing of what's wrong. And that's necessary. That is why the George Floyd video has had such a big impact, because it tells you on the human level, forget the how we're presenting in gender or race or ethnicity or age or social class. It tells you on a human level something is wrong, and that's necessary for change. Now, on a societal level, because I've been my earliest organizing profession was in the mid-1980s during welfare reform, is we're not going back. There is no, I've seen everything from there till now. I can't speak from before. There is no going back. I agree with Stephanie that COVID has also rung that same heartstring of level of humanity, right? Like, we're talking life and death, nothing more primal, nothing more sacred. And we've seen violations of that, as we saw a violation of the same heartstring in the snuffing out of the life of George Floyd. which we know represents not just one individual, but a whole class of people. And we know that COVID is that same strain, and the same thing is happening with a whole group of people of color are being disproportionately impacted, and we know that's en masse. One thing reflects thousands, 10,000s, hundreds of thousands, and history. So there's no going back. The pain is necessary, but I do believe that we're going to see better days before us. Why? Because history repeats itself, and there's beauty in the battle. And what I mean by that, in this last piece I want to say is, we have always depended on the people with the least to make the most impact, and that's what's happening today. People put their lines on the life to vote. People put their lines on the lives on the line for justice here locally and in the nation. And those people are the same people who are giving up their lives systematically, and they're gonna and it's gonna prevail.
That's right. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for offering those thoughts, because you know, it is important for us to not run away from the difficult topic of COVID and everything else. It does require us to stay mindful, and it's hard to stay mindful about this stuff. It's very anxiety inducing. Absolutely.